It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Reynolds. He's an associate professor, of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University and a senior fellow at FPRI. And Mike is really a great example of the type of scholars we're able to attract at FPRI. And I say that because besides the fact that he is an award-winning author and historian, he also is able to offer in-depth analysis on a wide variety of topics. So just to give you some examples, we have come to Mike and he has spoken for us on topics such as Ottoman and modern Middle East history, Russian and Eurasian history, the Caucasus, empire nationalism, which will be discussed today, Turkish foreign policy, and U.S. foreign policy. So please join me in welcoming Mike in what I know will be a very interesting talk.
Thank you very much, Tali, and thank you also to Alan and for organizing this and everything he does for FPRI, which I think is a very important organization. And also let me thank Rachel for her great handling of all the logistics for this conference. So I was asked to speak on the arrival of ethnic nationalism to the Middle East, and I was very happy to do that because this enables me to speak about the country in the Middle East that I know the best, which is Turkey, which is probably the best example of the implementation and the arrival of ethnic nationalism. And it'll also give me a chance to speak about one of the most important forces in the contemporary Middle East, which our previous speaker Adam mentioned, that is Kurdish nationalism. So I'll have some general remarks with most of my focus of my talk will be on Turkey and then on the role of the Kurds. So what I just wanted to start with here is just the map of the Middle East today, and just to make the basic point, which I think you all recognize, that the Middle East today is very different. The map of it is very, very different from the map of what it looked like about a century ago. So this is a map of the Middle East and the Muslim world in 1900. You'll notice here these parts in green. These are parts of the Muslim world that are occupied by European powers, but what I really want to draw people's attention to is this red, what you see in red, and that is the Ottoman Empire. Now, one of the things I think is very important to recognize is that the Ottoman Empire is not Turkey. I mean, the name tells you that, but oftentimes you'll see in history books and even sources, European sources from the 19th century and the early 20th century often use Turkey as a synonym for the Ottoman Empire, which is a very big mistake. You might be wondering, well, what does the Ottoman Empire mean? Where does this come from? Why do we call it Ottoman? What is this? This comes from the name, it's a dynasty. It's the name of the dynasty of Osman. Now, the name Osman is the Turkish pronunciation of the Arabic Uthman, and that has sort of a TH sound to it. Because you might say, how do you go from Osman to Ottoman? Well, the Arabic has sort of a TH sound to it, something between the S and the T. The Italians picked it up and gave it the Ottoman, which then was passed on to English. So that's why we call it the Ottoman Empire. That is the dynasty of Osman, who was the founder of it back in 1299. Whereas the Turks we call it Osmanlı, that is Osman, the sons of Osman. Another, I think, important thing that a lot of people don't understand about, again, the difference between the Ottoman Empire and Turkey. Certainly I know I didn't when I first started studying Middle Eastern history. I didn't understand is where actually did the Ottoman Empire emerge. Now, one trick that historians, I shouldn't say it's a trick, it's our instinct is always, if you want to talk about any given phenomenon, historians say, well, to really understand it, you have to go back earlier. So we're always pushing things back. So here I'm going to talk about the contemporary Middle East, and I say, well, to talk about Turkey, I've got to talk about the expansion of the Ottoman Empire. I'm not going to give a lecture on the expansion of the Ottoman Empire, but I do want to bring out what I think is one very important point. So when I first started doing Middle Eastern history, my assumption was, and again, I think this is most Americans probably assume, the Ottoman Empire started someplace here in Anatolia, and then they went on, conquered the Middle East, and then after that, they went, as most of you probably know, the Ottomans twice tried to take Vienna, in the heart of Europe. And then, so it was after consolidating their power in Anatolia, and then the Middle East, and then they started to push into Europe. That's very incorrect. And it is also quite significant if you want to understand why is it where we get the Turkish, if you want to understand the formation of the Turkish Republic, what you should understand is the Ottoman Empire has its origins in Western Anatolia. Here's the very beginnings of it, and then you'll see this orange territory in Western Anatolia. And then you'll see, then this is already 1359, 1451, these territories here, you'll see that well before they even consolidated control over Anatolia, let alone before they got into what we know as the Arab lands, the Ottoman Empire was already very squarely in the Balkans. And in fact, arguably, this is really the historical heartland of the empire, are these territories right there. And that's something important to understand if you want to know, if you want to understand the process of the formation of the Turkish Republic. Now, there is a process of decline of the Ottoman Empire. You can pick your various dates. Sometimes 1774 is when the Ottomans signed a treaty with Russia, which was the first time they unequivocally acknowledged that they had lost the war. A very common date also used is 1798, when Napoleon invaded Egypt and virtually unopposed, and that showed how weak the Ottoman Empire is. But the point is that by the end of the 18th century, it was clear to everybody that the Ottoman Empire was no longer a major player, that it had real difficulty defending itself. Now, the Ottomans included were among those who understood that we are in trouble, that we are much weaker than the major European powers. They did not sit around and just bemoan their fate. The beginning of the 19th century, or the end of the 18th century, and then through the 19th century, they undertook a very active program of reform that was comprehensive. Started off initially with military reform, then with other reforms of state institutions. And this was going on throughout the 19th century. And much of it was quite successful, but it still was not successful enough. And this map here shows what was going on in from 1878 to 1913. So we're getting into the final decades of the Ottoman Empire. So despite the fact that they are trying to reform themselves, their empire is falling apart. And what I'll come back to this, but I want to just bring your attention to this, as the empire falls apart in the Balkans, you'll notice the titles, names of some of these places, such as Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia. They sound something like nation states. And this is where we're beginning to see the arrival of ethnic nationalism. Now, nationalism is one of these terms that is used in so many different contexts. Oftentimes we call someone a nationalist simply if they're not democratic, or if they are aggressive. A group or a person will be labeled nationalist. It's used very loosely. I think one of the best sort of ways to understand this question and the arrival of nationalism in the Middle East is to go to Elie Kaddouri, who happened to be both a political philosopher and also a historian of the Middle East, and someone who actually himself came from the Middle East, and wrote a very important book entitled Nationalism. And right there on the first page, as he explains, he defines nationalism, or maybe I'll just read it. He says, briefly, nationalism is the doctrine holds that humanity is naturally divided into nations, that nations are known by certain characteristics which can be ascertained, and that the only legitimate type of government is national self-government. Now, this is not this is a belief, as Kaddouri says, that emerged. He makes the point. This is in the belief that emerged in Europe and became stronger in the 19th century. And then, as I've argued in some of my written work, this idea is then exported around the globe as the Europeans conduct their diplomacy. So it's a European-dominated global order is increasingly rests on this doctrine of nationalism by the end of the 19th century. Now, there's a huge contradiction in the idea that the Europeans are exporting this idea of nationalism at the same time they're also extending the control of their empires. I won't talk about that right now, but that if you have questions and answers, we could briefly touch on that. But there's a contradiction there. But nonetheless, the idea of the nation state increasingly informs the conduct of diplomacy. And this idea that humanity is naturally divided into nations that nations are known by certain characteristics which can be ascertained, and that the only legitimate type of government is national self-government. This becomes a very powerful idea in the 19th century, and especially then in the 20th century. Now, one of the problems with this idea of the national idea is that in the Middle East, as in many other parts of the world, the Middle East isn't really that exceptional in this, but it's very poorly suited to the Middle East. One, when you look at the Middle East, you will see, or you certainly saw in the past, ethnic settlement patterns are mixed. You see a lot of different ethnic groups sharing the same territories, living side by side. Another problem with exporting this idea or adopting this idea in the Middle East is that even at the beginning of the 20th century, there was no strong socioeconomic base for nationalism. That is, things usually identified as necessary prerequisites for nationalism, such as a highly literate population, the existence of a middle class, an industrial economy. These are things which theorists of nationalism have identified. These are key attributes, prerequisites that you need to develop a strong national identity. You don't find that in the Middle East. Even the Ottoman Empire, overwhelmingly at the beginning of the 20th century, it's an agricultural empire, very low rates of literacy in general. And another aspect is that you had another problem with the importation of the idea of a nation-state nationalism into the Middle East. So you have a lot of also very strongly competing identities and loyalties. Religious identities, tribal identities can be very strong, and then there are many clan identities and other forms of local identity. So the application of the idea of the nation-state to the Middle East has been very problematic for many different reasons. Now, one of the, as I mentioned, there was a very vigorous reform process that really takes steam in the 19th century. That, sort of simplify matters, that, as the reform process did do a great deal, but not enough to save the state. In the beginning of the 20th century, there was a group was formed that called itself the Committee of Union and Progress, often popularly known as the Young Turks. It's not a title that I prefer because that's really one that they didn't call themselves Young Turks. That was really a name given to them by Europeans. I have Young Turks, that's a typo. Young Turks, it should read. They call themselves Unionists. And what do they mean? What is the title? Committee of Progress and of Union and Progress. One, union meaning union of all the elements of the empire. That is their number one goal is we want to preserve the empire. We want to preserve this imperial Ottoman state. So that's their goal. And then progress is the question, how are we going to do it? Progress meant adopting basically European-style ideas of statehood, European-style ideas of administration. So in particular, centralizing the state and introducing what we could call more rational ideas of bureaucracy, having one legal code for the whole of the empire. And this group, the CUP, or the Committee of Union and Progress, the Unionists, they step on to the world stage in 1908 when they engineer what's called the oftentimes Young Turk Revolution, probably better known as the Constitutional Revolution, where they compel the Ottoman Sultan to bring back the constitution that he had abrogated. This was a constitution adopted in 1876, and then was shortly after a war with Russia. The argument was, well, we can't afford democracy at this time when our national security is under threat, so therefore I'm going to shelve both the Ottoman Parliament and this constitution. This group, the Union of Progress, organized a mutiny in the army and forced the Sultan to bring back the Constitution because the idea was constitutional rule. This is part of the progressive reforms that we want. Now these pictures here are of not two brothers, not the Pasha brothers. Pasha is a Turkish title that basically means major general. It's also given to people in the civil bureaucracy that occupy a rank equivalent to a major general. So it's an honorary title or a rank. So when you see that and you're reading about Pasha, it's not like, oh wow, this Pasha family has really been quite influential in the Ottomans. So these are two of the key leaders of the Committee of Union and Progress. One is Enver Pasha, who became the Minister of War in 1914. He was the hero of the revolution of 1908. And then Talat Pasha, who became the Minister of Interior during World War I. And they are useful to put them up there, not simply because they were both key figures, but you'll see Enver is a military officer. Talat Pasha, who becomes Minister of Interior, was a civil servant. And that's really was the heart of this movement, the Committee on Union Progress. It drew most of its members from military officers and civil servants in the government. Now, why is that important? Why am I emphasizing that? Because they were the ones who wanted to save the state above all. Now, so they were very much committed to saving the state, and they were also, as people who were educated, many of them knew foreign languages, and were very much aware that our state is in real trouble. They understood how Europeans do things. They thought, if we're going to save ourselves, we've got to borrow more ideas and practices from the Europeans. So their ideas on how to save the state were very much, the idea, again, of centralization, having a unified code of law. They were generally much more pro-secularization. They saw Islam as being an impediment to progress, something that impedes technological progress, that impedes economic growth. And they weren't in this, well, some of them were quite anti-Islam. But again, the key thing with them is they want to save the state. Now, maybe I should just go back to this map here. So they come to power, I said, in 1908. Or rather, they forced the Sultan to introduce both elections and the Constitution in 1908. And you'll notice here that they lose this territory, Tripoli and Cyrenaica, in 1912. And you'll see that they then lose these territories in the Balkans in 1912, 1913. And these territories formally lost to the Ottomans in 1908 and here. So they have this great idea, we've got the Constitution back. And what happens from that point on, their empire continues to fracture and collapse. The Italians grab these territories, but the key, really, I think the key moment is 1912 and 1913 when you have these Balkan Wars, where the Ottomans fought a coalition of the Balkan powers, the Greeks, the Bulgarians, Serbians, and they lost that war, which was a shock because these are not, one thing to lose a war to the Russians, another thing to have the British take your territory. These are major players. Now you're losing to your own former subjects, the Serbians, the Greeks. These are, at best, they're very new states. They're on the rank of states. They're at the third tier states. So that very much shook up the Ottomans. That how weak have we become now that our former subjects are beating us? But along with that is that the nature of the war, the Balkan Wars, was well, all wars are ugly, but the Balkan Wars were particularly. These were wars that saw a great deal of massacres on all sides, and that concluded with the expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Muslims from the Balkan territories, who then showed up in Anatolia, something like 400,000 or so. Now there had been, as the Russian Empire had been expanding down through the Caucasus, and also as it extended its influence in the Balkans, there had been progressively larger and larger waves of expulsions of Muslims who would be coming into Anatolia. Sometimes that gets overemphasized. Empires are generally used to living with very diverse populations, and they are often very much concerned to maintain populations regardless of who it is, because you can tax them. Populations, you can extract wealth from them. So the expulsions of Muslims from the Caucasus and from the Balkans prior to the Balkan Wars, it's significant, particularly from the Crimea. But the Balkan Wars are a different thing, are of a different quality, because the Muslims are driven out of there with the idea that they have no place in these Balkan countries, which all see themselves as having revolted against the Turks, against the Ottomans. They want to establish their own homogenous societies, and Muslims have no place in there. And again, this is the heartland of the Ottoman Empire. So when they lose this, it's not like, let's say, the British withdraw from India. Well, this is a colonial area. We understood that it was never really ours to begin with, or one might say when the French leave Algeria, the French tried to convince themselves that Algeria is really part of France, but I think they knew it wasn't quite the same as France. This is a real traumatic experience for the Ottomans psychologically, because this is where our forefathers lived for 400 years. I mean, one equivalent might be, let's say, if the United States had people driven out of Ohio, for example. and then they're showing up in New England. So psychologically, but then also physically, that you had lots of people killed, and then you had refugees showing up. So that convinces the Committee of Union and Progress that not only do we have to reform, we have to become ultra-radical reformers. 1914, you have a war. So 1913, there's a military coup, and they install a military dictatorship. What's equivalent to a one-party dictatorship, probably the best way to describe it. So they came initially with the idea we're going to restore the Constitution. By 1913, they already have implemented the one-party state. They go into World War I. They allied themselves with Germany. It was a very rational decision at the time. Germany had no direct claims on any Ottoman territory. Germany is a very powerful state. And they put their bet on the idea that the Germans would win the war. It almost worked out. World War I was a very close affair. One of the major consequences of the war for the Ottomans was the fact that the Russian Empire couldn't bear the strain of the war, and you had the Bolshevik Revolution, which leads to the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, which is very critical to the emergence of the Turkish Republic, as I'll explain in a moment. But in 1918, with the loss of the empire, they flee. Now, this is a map of, you saw some of this with the SykesPicot map here. This is what I prefer to call the SykesPicot-Sazonov plan. Sazonov was the name of the Russian foreign minister who signed off on it. And this is the vision of what was going to, that the Entente had, the British, the French, and the Russians in particular. The Italians were also part of this. What they were going to do, what was going to become of the Ottoman Empire. And you'll see here, the key thing is that you'll see there's this sort of rump Turkish state of some sort is going to be left here. That was all that was going to be left of the Ottoman Empire. So it's kind of the point maybe is, even though you're paranoid, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they aren't out to get you. Now that's at the end of World War I. So as Russia has fell into revolution and disintegrated. But this idea that came from the Sykes-Picot-Sazonov Treaty doesn't disappear. Instead, there's a Treaty of Sevres signed in 1920, and this is the vision of how what they're going to do with Anatolia. And this is something that every Turkish school child knows this map. And you'll notice it looks very similar to the preceding map, but with two significant exceptions I want to point out. One, this is blue territory here, which in the other map was going to be under Russian control, is now going to be part of a greater Armenia. And this territory here is going to be a Kurdish autonomous region with the idea that I think it was in 5 years it would be able to apply for independence. And then the Europeans, if they saw fit, might greet it independence. So there was the idea that we'll establish a Kurdish entity there. Now, so what happened? Why wasn't this Treaty of Sevres? This is what the great powers, the victors of World War I, this is what they wanted to see done. Why wasn't it? Mainly because of, I shouldn't say mainly, in large part, but not entirely, due to this person right here, Mustafa Kemal Pasha. Again, that was his rank, is not part of the Pasha family. It was an Ottoman general, extremely capable field commander, made his name in the Battle of Gallipoli as he won victories there and elsewhere. He is credited with leading the resistance to the implementation of this Treaty of Sevres. However, I should point out that Mustafa Kemal did not do this all on his own. Prior to the end of World War I, when I mentioned that these Committee of Union and Progress flee the Ottoman Empire, they flee Istanbul on the submarine, they make preparations. They realize this war is coming to an end, but there's going to be another war for Anatolia, and they begin preparing for that. They have arms stockpiled in Anatolia, and they have people ready to lead a resistance movement. They say, we're going to start a movement of popular resistance. It's Mustafa Kemal then who emerges, who takes command of that movement. And he leads what's called, what the Turks call the War of National Liberation, basically from 1919 to 1922. Now that war is one fought primarily against two foes. One is in the east against the Armenians, who didn't have very strong forces, but you remember this map here, they were going to get a good chunk of territory there. And sort of after securing their rear, they then take on the Greeks, who were given the go-ahead by the victors of World War I to take large chunks of Anatolia. Now they drive out, so they defeat the Armenians in the east, and then they drive out the Greeks from the west. And along with that, with the populations, both the Armenian populations and the Greek populations are killed off, driven out of Anatolia. So you're left with a Anatolia that is overwhelmingly Muslim. The British and the French and the Italians had all been exhausted by World War I, and there was some idea the British that might challenge Mustafa Kemal, but then they ultimately said, okay, we're not actually going to fight you, and they recognized what becomes the borders of contemporary Turkey in almost the borders, largely the borders of contemporary Turkey in the Treaty of Lausanne. And it's at that point that you have Mustafa Kemal comes to power, or rather, he should say he takes charge of the resistance movement in 1919. It's in 1923 he's able to establish the Republic of Turkey. And it's at that point, now we have a new title, right? The new name for this country, Turkey, is what it's called. And now the vision of Mustafa Kemal and the Turkish Republic is, or maybe I should phrase it this way. The basic goal of the Turkish Republic is to put an end to this process of imperial dissolution and decline that the Ottoman Empire had faced. So you remember the maps showing the decline from 1878 to 1913, and then you saw that final map showing how the vision of what was going to become of Anatolia. This is what the founders of the Turkish Republic, they want to make sure this doesn't happen again, that they are able to hold on to Anatolia and that no one will be able to break up this territory and to fracture it. So the two sort of pillars of the Turkish Republic are, one, secularism. Now, why are they so insistent upon being secular? That is, making sure you're not excluding Islam as an influence upon laws, and excluding Islam as a force for the regulation of public society. One is because Mustafa Kemal, like his predecessors in the Committee of Union and Progress, see Islam as a impediment to technological and economic progress, and so it's something that they regard as kept the Ottomans weak. Another problem is that Islam competes with ethnic identity. That is, if we Turks continue to identify with the Muslims, we're going to get ourselves dragged into all sorts of conflicts, be it in the Balkans, be it in the Arab world, be it in any part of the Muslim world. We don't want that. We've had enough wars. We are out for ourselves. We are no longer we don't want to be dragged into conflicts that other Muslims might become embroiled. Now, Islam was, some of the people, the founders of the Turkish Republic, very well might have liked, in fact, we know that they would have liked to have abolished Islam entirely. However, Islam was much too strong among the populace for there to be any true radical movements or attempt by the state to completely disestablish it. So rather than sort of try to eliminate Islam, instead what the Turkish state did was take it over. And when I mean take it over, I mean literally all religious properties were taken over by the state. All mosques were put under state control. All religious authorities became employees of the state. So imagine if this happened in the U.S., it would be all church properties, synagogues, mosques, etc., would all be put under the control of the state. So so that was, and there were a number of, so that was one way to control Islam. We'll make sure that they answer to the state and they'll take their orders from Ankara. Now, there were a number of other reforms that Mustafa Kemal pursued, because one key element of the Turkish Republic was secularism, which is tied in with the other key part of it, which is nationalism, which is teaching the population of the Turkish Republic that you are a Turk. Now this was, they declared the Turkish Republic essentially regarded everybody inside of the borders of the Turkish Republic, with the exception of the Christians and Jews who fell in the Treaty of Lausanne. They were regarded as being sort of official minorities, but all Muslims were now, the one identity they could have was that of being Turkish. Now the purpose of this wasn't so much, it's not so much an exercise in Turkish chauvinism, that Turks think they're better than others, what it was an emphasis trying the idea was to create a homogeneous body of people, community, that could not be divided, that no one from the outside could go and agitate among one part of the group and say, well, you know, you're a little bit different from these guys, you should break away. The idea is create a society where everyone identifies both with each other and with the state. Because as they saw, and they couldn't get into it, but the process of the breakup of the Ottoman Empire very much there was always a lot of outside intervention going on, encouraging certain people in the name of their communities to revolt against the empire. So the idea here is we're going to prevent that happening by creating a community that's homogeneous, identifies with itself, and identifies very strongly with the state. Now to do that, there were a number of reforms that Mustafa Kemal carried out. One was the alphabet reform. So the Turkish language is not Arabic, but it had used the Arabic alphabet. The Ottomans had used that up until 1928, when Mustafa Kemal says, okay, we're going to use a Latin alphabet. And you can see this is an iconic photo of him. He's acting as a teacher, a school teacher, teaching people, here is the new alphabet. Now, part of this was for the sake of increasing literacy. The Arabic alphabet doesn't fit Turkish that well. The Arabic has basically can represent 3 vowels, but Turkish has 8 vowels. So it makes it somewhat complicated to read Turkish in the Arabic script. But also, the other thing was you wanted to break the link between Turks and the Arabs in the Middle East as part of these very much westernizing, Europeanizing reforms. And the other was to break the link, particularly with Islam, that they're going to use a script that's different from the script of the Quran. So there was also a cultural and element and psychological element to the alphabet reform as well. Dress codes, sartorial changes were made. In 1925, one of the first reforms that Mustafa Kemal insists upon, he bans the fez, which had become the symbol, which is kind of, you know, it was, I think, about a century before the end of the Ottoman Empire, they adopted the fez. And it was to show sort of the Ottoman Empire was reforming and changing. The fez under Mustafa Kemal is abolished, and the men are supposed to wear Western-style headgear. So here, Mustafa Kemal making the point in this top hat, and you'll see here he is with another, I forget what kind they call it, is it a trilby? Or you'll see everyone here has new hats they're wearing rather new hats. And this is a way of making the point very visually to people that you are changing. We are changing our orientation. And here's just Mustafa Kemal in the tuxedo, again setting the example for his nation that we are now Turks. We are a very different entity than the Ottomans were. This map, another important change was the moving the capital from Istanbul, a great imperial capital, to what was a very dusty small town in the center of Anatolia. And that became the heart of the Republic. Partially that was a strategic move. Let's put the capital in a less exposed area, but it was also sending a signal to people that we are moving away from the Ottoman past, which is very much tied up with religion, and a much more cosmopolitan order, to one where we are building a nation state of Turks for Turks. There are, along with the alphabet reform, which I mentioned, there was also a language reform where the Turkish language was not entirely purified, but was a lot of Arabic and Persian words were driven out of the vocabulary, and the equivalent to that might be, imagine, in the English language, we started going out, stopped using, you were banned from using words of French origin or of Latin, and you could only use Anglo-Saxon words. And that was, again, part of it to emphasize that we are no longer tied culturally to our neighbors, the Iranians, or to the Arabs, and that's and also to break the influence of Islam on Turkish society. Now, the name Ataturk, and here you'll see the signature. This is a name adopted in 1934. All Turks were required to adopt surnames. And so everyone in 34 then had to, many people made up their names or chose names, they're the son of so-and-so, etc. But they all had to come up with last names. Ataturk was the name given to Mustafa Kemal, and what it means is the father of the Turks. So I mean, there was nothing kind of sneaky about what Mustafa Kemal is doing. It's all quite clear. Adopting this name, Father of the Turks, he's engaged in the project of creating a Turkish nation, a new nation, and he takes this name Ataturk, the father of the Turks. Now, this is a very well-known saying of the Turkish Republic, Ne mutlu Türk'üm diyene. What that means is, what joy to him or her. Turkish doesn't have Turkish language doesn't have gender, so it can apply to males, females, or neither. So, what joy to him or her who says, "I am a Turk." Now, there are a number of ways you can read that. One might think, oh, that's kind of, again, the expression of Turkish nationalism would be a misreading of it, because it doesn't say, what joy to him or her who is a Turk, but rather to the one who says they are a Turk. So this was the Turkish Republic is teaching its people that you are now Turks, regardless of whether you are an ethnic Turk, or as you looked at Anatolia, you have lots of people. I mentioned you have these refugees from the Balkans. So you have Albanians, you have Pomaks, you have Greek-speaking Muslims who are Muslims but they speak Greek. You have Arabs living in Anatolia. You have a group called the Laz. I could go on. You have many people from the Caucasus, Circassian, etc. They're all being taught that you are a Turk, and this sort of underscores it. What joy to him her who says, "I am a Turk." So the point is, to become a Turk, all you have to do if you're a Muslim is say, "I am a Turk," and then you are a full-fledged citizen of the Republic, and what a wonderful thing that is to be a Turk. So in pushing these ideas, of course, the Turkish, this is a state project. It's an exercise in social engineering. The various institutions of the state, in particular schools, of course, are a key aspect of this. What children are taught in schools, what's in textbooks. The army is another key actor in turning Anatolians into Turks. Now, this has been a remarkably successful project in my estimation. Today, if you go around Turkey, the vast majority of Turks, Turkish citizens, identify as Turks, and they might tell you, okay, yes, my grandfathers came from the Balkans, or we're Circassians, we're Cherkess, or we're Laz. But it's very similar, I think, to the way Americans of various backgrounds have assimilated to an American identity. And they might remember, okay, my grandfather was a member of a Polish-American club, but they're fundamentally Americans, speak English, and identify effectively as being Americans in the same way, or a roughly analogous way. I think that can be said about Turkey. It's been as some people look at this Turkish project of teaching people that they're Turks, it looks kind of crazy when you look at what they've done, but it's been, again, I think remarkably successful, with one major exception. This is, I should mention, part of it as well. You'll see the Turkish Republic. You'll see various phrases on, so this is again, Ne mutlu Türk'üm diyene, oh, what joy to him or her who says, "I'm a Turk." And you'll see this is on the countryside. And there are certain parts of Turkey where you would go and you would see emblazoned on the countryside either this, or either simply the sign of the Turkish, symbol of the Turkish state, or you'd see things like the homeland is indivisible. Now that might strike you as kind of odd. Why do they feel it's so important to put this, okay, if it's in schools or in textbooks, but why do they have to put it on the sides of hills and mountains? Because it's certain parts of the country have seen a lot more of this than others. And this is so the big exception to the success of Turkish, the building of a Turkish nation, the nationalization, or the Turkification, I suppose you could say, of the population in Anatolia, are the Kurds. And as you see, this is a map. It's dated, but it's still quite accurate. In the Soviet Union, you can ignore that. What I want to focus on is right here. You'll see that this part of Turkey, particularly the southeast, I mean, this is somewhat gives you a, these areas do not mean that Kurds are the predominant group, merely that there are significant numbers of them. But this territory right here in the southeast of Turkey is very heavily Kurdish. So why are the Kurds an exception? Why did I say it's been so successful with this one, except for the Kurds? Well, there are basically two reasons. One is that there are significant numbers of Kurds inside of Turkey. No one knows the exact number because it's not permitted inside of Turkey. If the idea is there's one identity officially recognized, then there's no way to officially or formally collect data on people's ethnic identity. But usually most estimates are something like 12 to 15% of Turkey are Kurdish. So it's more than 10%. It's a sizable number. So that's one reason. There are lots of them, whereas a lot of the other groups were kind of so small and they were dispersed and they assimilated. The Kurds, however, the other second reason why I mentioned they're compactly settled. So I mentioned the areas in the southeast are very heavily Kurdish, which means, of course, if you're growing up there and you're told a Turk at school, but you're coming home and you're speaking Kurdish in your home and on the street, etc., well, that kind of becomes difficult to reconcile. Wait a second, I speak a different language at home, and you realize that you have another identity. So the Turks have not been able to assimilate the Kurds. Now, this wasn't, the Kurdish question has been a big question for Turkey right from the beginning of the Republic. Shortly after its foundation in 1823, you had a number of Kurdish revolts that took place. All of those, they failed. They failed for a number of reasons. One is that they were launched not necessarily even so much out of opposition to Turkish nationalism, but to the secularizing reforms, were one of the things that really alienated a lot of the Kurds early on in the Turkish Republic. And that tells you something. It tells you that the idea of a Kurdish identity did not necessarily take precedence over a Muslim identity. Another reason why some of these revolts failed was because the Kurds were divided among themselves with different tribal identities, and also there were some sectarian differences, and that also fractured the Kurds. The levels of, so we might be asking, well, why did the Kurds have a stronger sense of their own collective identity? And as you look at the areas, and this applies not just to Turkey, it applies to the other parts of the Middle East as well, to where the Kurds live in Syria, Iraq, Iran, you'll notice they're in a very sort of remote area. And throughout most of the modern history, or I should say from even before the modern history of the Middle East, is sort of a backwater. And the Kurds, as a result, have very low levels of literacy. And there were no predominantly Kurdish cities. Most Kurds lived as pastoral nomads. So the whole idea of having kind of the Kurdish nation was a totally alien idea. Even you saw that map where of Sevres, where the Europeans had an idea, recognized, well, they're Kurds, so let's give them some kind of state of their own. That was a very alien idea to the vast majority of Kurds. There were some Kurdish intellectuals who were able to follow these things. But back then, many Kurds were first and foremost afraid of, well, if we don't join with the Turks in their war of liberation, we're going to be under the rule of the Armenians. And that was a major impetus for them to join with the Turks, with the Armenians or some other, or the great power backers of the Armenians. But as a result of the Turkish Republic's success in building institutions and building schools and teaching people that they're Turks, more and more Kurds have discovered that, wait a second, I'm not exactly a Turk, who am I? And have discovered, well, we are in fact Kurds. And let me come to this. This is just a map showing this distribution of Kurds. So the largest number is, this is a rough estimate, but let's say about 14 million or so inside of Turkey, another significant, 7.8 in Iran, 5.4 million in Iraq, 2 million in Syria. Those in Turkey, so there were a number of revolts. They were suppressed. There was an organization known as the Kurdistan Workers' Party. It was founded by a university student by the name of Abdullah Öcalan, who was a Kurd, founds this organization called the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which then in 1984 began an insurgency against the Turkish Republic. And that organization continues now, is currently engaged, again, renewed its war with the Turkish Republic. And what's kind of interesting to note about this is that, of course, he's a very prominent figure. He's sort of almost a semi-deity to the Kurds, much like Mustafa Kemal was made for the Turks. Mustafa Kemal is regarded as almost a quasi, godlike figure by the institutions of the Turkish Republic. the Kurds, Öcalan sort of imitating that, saying, okay, a nation should have a father sort of figure, has kind of filled the role of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, but is trying to do it for the Kurds. So the Kurds have taken many of the lessons about nationalism from the Turks, and as they've been educated by the Turkish Republic and discovered who we are as Kurds, even though Öcalan, for example, writes in Turkish. And most of the PKK in its operations actually rely upon Turkish as their main language of communication. They have, it's a response, an interesting response to the emergence of Turkish nationalism. Sort of, maybe you could say that here in this case, Turkish nationalism has been even more successful than it dared ever hope, in that it's now created sort of a mirror image among the Kurds. I didn't mention, and I should know, the Turkish Republic. So this is about the Middle East. I spent a lot of time talking about Turkey, and I did that deliberately, both because it's the case that I know best. But I should point out that what happened in Turkey wasn't entirely exceptional. You'll see many of the things that they did were applied in Europe. But in terms of the Middle East, in Arab nationalism, both in Syria, in Iraq, where you had attempts to build an Arab nationalism, some of the points that's overlooked, or I may phrase it differently. One of the interesting parallels is that whereas nationalism oftentimes today, and rightly so, is criticized as being a very pernicious influence because it creates differing groups of peoples and sets them in opposition to each other. One of the appeals for in the earlier parts of the 20th century in the Middle East was that, on the one hand, although it creates opposition between ethnic groups, it can also serve to paper over or overcome even sectarian differences. So one of the key supporters of Turkish nationalism in the Turkish Republic has been the Alevi population inside of Turkey, who are not Sunnis, but were felt much more comfortable in saying, let's not talk about our religious differences, let's emphasize our common Turkish ethnicity. Likewise, we can see a similar dynamic in parts of the Arab world, and I have in mind Syria and Iraq, where you had a number of Christians who were very prominent proponents of Arab nationalism. You had also the Alawites in Syria, very much identified with this, because that means, again, we don't have to speak about what separates us in terms of religion, but let's speak about what unites us in terms of language and our ethnic identity. And likewise in Iraq, where you have Sunnis and Shia, where there too the idea would be that by emphasizing our common Arabness, we can kind of overcome these differences. Now, in the case of Iraq, that creates a different dynamic when you're now dealing with Kurds, which is a separate, that would be a title of a separate lecture, the role of the Kurds inside of Iraq and their fate there. So why don't I'll end on this note, and I'll take questions. Is someone passing? Okay.
Is this on? Thank you. My name is Jim Feldman from Lakeshore High School in St. Clair Shores, Michigan. I had a question about the Turkish Workers' Party. Looking at the slide, I kind of got a Maoist, Stalinist kind of vibe with it. Did they, steal any of their kind of ideas from Mao or Stalin?
Absolutely. It's one of the key influences. I mean, the name tells you Kurdistan Workers' Party, founded in the Cold War, very much influenced by Marxist ideology. Öcalan is very much, his cult of personality very much similar to Stalin's. And you read their stuff, and your mind begins to spin after a while, which is part of that's deliberate, because that helps inculcate this belief that Öcalan is this semi-divine character. So very much they've been influenced by Marxist-Leninism and it's a good parallel to draw with Stalinism. Öcalan, after he was captured in 1999, and he's currently arrested on an island in Turkey. Arrested. He's still permitted to. He's written things and published books. And one of the big questions is, he really changed the organization or the ideology or not? I mean, he's come up with this new idea, which is much closer, been influenced by ideas of anarchism, and claims to be much more democratic. But again, another problem, Öcalan's the one under arrest. He's still revered by the PKK, but the ones actually running the organization are located in Kandil in Iraq. And they say that they listen to him, but that's not really clear. But you're absolutely right. This is very much influenced by Marxist-Leninism and Stalinism as well.
Paul Dickler, FPRI. I had a question about a likely de facto Kurdistan that exists in Iraq and what its impact would be on the Kurds in the other three countries. And in light of the fact that the PKK has been basing itself largely in Iraq.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I was actually in Erbil this summer, so I kept my. So this is sort of the capital of the Kurdistan regional government inside of Iraq. One of the the beliefs is that, like, let me say this: one of the big problems in commentary in the Middle East today is people speak about the Kurds as if they're one single united group. Which they are not, either linguistically. There are at least 3 major Kurdish dialects. They are not mutually comprehensible. I mean, it doesn't take that much to learn one to speak the other, but they are not. They are separate, certainly separate dialects. Arguably, some would say they're separate languages. So there is strong linguistic divisions among the Kurds. That's not unusual. One can look at the formation of France. It took some time for the French language to become unified, but they are not there yet. There are still very strong tribal divisions. There are strong, though, political divisions, and that's one of I think key things is in this Kurdistan regional government. There are 2 major players there. One that calls itself the Kurdistan Democratic Party, the other that calls itself the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan. Now that sounds like, okay, Democrats, Republicans, there are ideological differences. You scratch a little bit and you find that, well, no, actually this is much more tied up with linguistic and tribal differences, and that they simply call themselves now having political parties. So there is a significant rift there. Now, the PKK is based in Kandil in northern Iraq. They are an entirely different organization from both the PUK and the KDP. And the PUK and KDP are both rather, the PKK is a major competitor of theirs. Now, because they do identify at some level, we are all Kurds, we've all been kicked around by our governments, there is certainly sympathy at some level between them, but there's also a lot of fear and suspicion. I mean, the PUK and the KDP have fought each other quite bitterly in the 1990s and prior to that. And the PKK, now the KDP and the PUK, as I mentioned, they're kind of more political parties that stand in for tribal interests. PKK is a revolutionary organization that is dedicated to uprooting tribal differences and has had a Marxist-Leninist orientation and has a very different vision of the Kurdish future than do the KDP or the PUK. And so, if we were to say, let's solve, if Syria, let's say Syria is today's one unified state, and Iraq is as well, and Iran and Turkey, and they would say, hey, look, we think the Kurds should all be their own group. They can take all the chunks of territory they claim in our territories. It's all theirs. Let them have it. Would that mean that everything would be wonderful among the Kurds? No, that would mean there have to be a major civil war among the Kurds to decide, okay, who's really going to be running it? Is it going to be the PKK, the KDP, or PUK, or those would be the 3 major contenders, and they are not on the same page.
The other question I had connected with it is, I was in Turkey when Öcalan was captured. At that point, being an American was a great time to be in Turkey. It's like we were heroes. In fact, they were crediting Israel as well with the capture. Now, in light of how things have morphed, and there have been all kinds of tensions involving Iraq and U.S. foreign policy and so forth, how do you see this shaking out in light of the Kurds?
That's an excellent question because it's explosive. I used that phrase earlier that just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they aren't out to get you. So the Turks have this thing about the Sever syndrome, is what it's called, which is a good description of, let me go back to that map of Sever. And this is, again, something that this is a more colorful version of it. Every Turkish school kid knows this. This is the nightmare scenario of the Turkish Republic. This is what the whole republic is established to prevent. Now they look at, this is what the great powers are going to do. And they might say, okay, Americans, we didn't have anything to do with this. I mean, I think Adam mentioned that America was going to become, there was talk that we were going to come and have a mandate out here with the Armenians. We didn't. So I think the U.S., we're not the British, we're not the French, we're not a colonial power. In the Turkish mindset, you are a great power, the Americans, and you, like every great power, your goal must be to keep us weak and to keep us divided. And what's the easiest, the most obvious way to do that? Support the Kurds. So there's always been the suspicion that the U.S. and the Europeans are backing Kurdish separatism. Now you mentioned the capture of Öcalan. Many Turks were very happy about that. And so Öcalan, yes, I should mention the capture of Öcalan. Speaking about paranoids, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they aren't out to get you. Öcalan, who had been living in Syria for many years and running the war, the PKK's war against Turkey from Syria, Turkey mobilized, when was it? I think in 1998, mobilized on the Syrian border and said, if you don't get rid of this guy, we're going to invade. The Syrians said, okay, Öcalan, you've got to pack your bags. So where does he go? He goes around the world, shows up in Italy. He's got, I can't remember, he showed them France, but he had lots of friends there. There were a number of European prominent politicians trying to get him refuge there. He traveled to Russia, was hoping to be able to hole up there. He's caught in Nairobi, Kenya, and handed over, or the Turks themselves, their security forces, special forces captured them. A lot of the Turks themselves, okay, he must have had help. And usually people point to the U.S. and maybe the Israelis as having helped him out. When he was captured, where was he? He was trying to get to the airport. He was leaving the Greek embassy, and he had a passport from Greece. Now Greece, okay, we know Turks and Greeks have a contentious history with each other, but Greece is a NATO ally. And if you can imagine, if a fellow NATO ally is supporting your number one enemy, Öcalan is equivalent to Turks the way Osama bin Laden is for Americans. So you can imagine, I don't know, the French. We always like to pick on the French and so forth. The French gave Osama bin Laden, he was captured with a French passport coming out of the French embassy. And so the Turks are paranoid about this stuff. And they'll tell you, like even Öcalan's captured, say, well, we helped you get Öcalan. Why do you think the U.S. is and we have given them lots of intelligence aid against the PKK. So still there's the belief, well, you're just, you're helping us a bit, but you're keeping them in play and you're going to use them against us. And this is a major fear inside of Turkey, has been in the past couple of years of what's going on in Syria. And now with the Kurds emerging as one of the best opponents to Daesh or the Islamic State, ISIS, whatever you want to call it. And the U.S. is now collaborating with, let me get a more, in northern Syria, the PKK has these organizations. They're under a different name, but they're controlled by the PKK. They're part of the PKK. But we're able to say, well, it's a different organization. It's not the PKK, the PYD, the YPG. And so we can work with them. But this has the Turks extremely nervous. And one of my fears is that American weapons fall into their hands, and the PKK, which has been waging attacks incessantly in Turkey since July, American arms, if they're caught doing that and killing Turks, it could be really very explosive in Turkish-American relations.
Hello. I grew up with a number of Turks and just socially. And often when you speak to someone that's Turkish, and you say to them, well, where are you from? They'll say, oh, I'm not from the village area. I'm from the city. So I have two solutions to this in my mind. Do you think that it's because they don't want to equate themselves with the Kurds who are more rural? Or is it because they want to be seen as more Western because of Mustafa's reforms?
It could be both, but it's probably, I think, the second, that they just don't want to be associated with people from the villages. One of the, particularly those, there was a lot of Turks came to Germany in particular in the 1950s. They were brought in as guest workers. Of course, they've stayed there so much for being guest workers. Like often this happens. They're still there, and their descendants, which is a whole can of worms of its own. But one of the, most of those who showed up in Germany were from the villages. And so this is one of the culture class, of course, suddenly living and going from Turkey to Germany is a huge switch, but particularly going from a village. So when they had the religious holidays and they were supposed to do sacrifice animals, etc., they're doing that either in the street or in their bathtubs, which makes the Germans go crazy because who are these crazy people? And the Turks, this is what there's nothing weird about this. This is what we do. And so that there might have been another, maybe along with those, has been like Turkey, like so many other countries throughout the world, particularly in the so-called developing world, has undergone rapid urbanization. And so places like Istanbul, people, older generation of people in Istanbul say, oh, it's no longer a city, it's just become a big Anatolian village. Suddenly all these people came in from the villages overnight and have settled in Istanbul, and they'll complain about they are, they're not real city people, they brought the village to the city. So that's been, maybe as Jonathan mentioned this morning, class is another important marker. I think that's really probably what's going on there.
Thank you. Brian Harding, Mott Community College in Flint, Michigan. Can we go back to the map of the Treaty of Severus?
Sure.
Thank you.
Let me think that was, where did I have that? Yeah, this one.
There you go. Please let me know if I understand correctly this. So as of 1920, there's an international agreement that there should be a country, an independent country called Kurdistan. But within a few years that did not take place, and primarily it's because the Turks waged a successful war in the east against the Armenians.
Yeah, so the idea this was going to be an autonomous entity tied to this, there's going to be a rump Turkish state here, and then this Kurdish thing would be attached to it. And I think it was 5 years, then it would be eligible to become fully independent. Now, it never took off because, not simply because you had Mustafa Kemal, who begins his resistance out in this part of Anatolia, but a lot of the Kurds joined him as well. And their fear was, now I didn't bring a map of Kurdistan and Armenia, but these territories are claimed by both Kurds and Armenians historically. Now, and the lead up into World War I, people talk about relations between Turks and Armenians. The fundamental conflict was really between Kurds and Armenians at a sociological level. And World War I, they are killed off, driven out of this area of Anatolia. The Kurds are still left there, but in the immediate aftermath of the World War I, the Kurds are very fearful that they're going to come right back in. And that was one of the major incentives that the Kurds had to fight with the Turks. I might also mention initially, the Turks, when they under Mustafa Kemal, and I say Turks, they fought their war in the name of Islam, in the name of Muslim Brotherhood. Not the Muslim Brotherhood, but the idea of all Muslims are, not all Muslims are rather emphasizing that people live, Muslims of Anatolia and in northern Iraq. So Mosul was originally supposed to be, in their vision, was going to be part of this new state they were going to establish. The British, however, refused to give Mosul up. And one of the kind of counterfactuals, had the British said, okay, you can take Mosul, they were going to call it the land of the Turks and the Kurds. And you might have had a very different playing out of history. But when they were denied Mosul, that made it much easier then, because you had Kurds here, but they're about 10% of the population probably at that time. They're not very powerful. So you could try to go ahead with this idea, we're going to assimilate everybody and make them a Turk.
Great. Thank you.
Hi, John Larkins from Richmond, Virginia. I guess I had three questions, but I want to try to combine them into kind of one thing. From the story that you've painted for us, is that Kurdish nationalism is sort of, in a sense, a byproduct of a reaction to Turkish nationalism. And so that brings up the question, is in the region, in order for nationalism to be successful, does there have to be an other in opposition to Palestine and Israeli, for example? But then I thought about, well, why then did Arab nationalism sort of act as a failure? And I guess the last comment I would make, I read something recently that predicted Turkey as the next failed state in the region, primarily because of demography, that Kurdish demography will eventually create this Kurdish state. So there's a lot of things there, but I'll let you go where you want.
Yeah, no, those are very good questions. Yeah, no, the picture I'm painting of Kurdish nationalism being a reaction, which isn't in any way, don't mean to diminish Kurdish identity in any way, because you can make the same point. The formation of Turkish nationalism, my argument is very much a geopolitical phenomenon. That's really what one has to understand, is how do we get this Turkish Republic? Well, it's a response to the downfall of the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, and the realization if you're going to have a state that's going to survive in this new global order, it's got to be a nation state, and it should be homogenous so that it can't be divided. And then that, in the way Abdullah Öcalan has formulated Kurdish nationalism, in some sense you can see it as a reaction towards Turkish nationalism. Of course, the story of Kurds in Iraq is a bit different. But they realize with the Arab nationalism side of Iraq that they are Kurds. It does seem to be very much the formation of any identity often needs another, and the Middle East is not at all unusual in this. I mean, one can go all throughout the world and find very similar things. And let me see, I guess what was the last question? Well, about the demography, right? So right now, because no one has hard statistics on this, but it looks like that the Turkish population is largely stabilized, and the Kurdish population is still growing inside of Turkey. The key thing here, I think, is urbanization. Is whenever people start moving to cities, that's when their population really starts to fall. And and this is one of the problems of the idea, we can solve this Kurdish problem by dividing up Turkey. If I could come to the map of the Kurds. If we just give, let's say, these parts of Turkey away, actually better, let me come to the, it's not working now. Oh, I'm pressing the wrong button, that's why. Right, this kind of gives you this is the election results earlier this year, and you'll see here's where the HDP, the Kurdish party, did particularly well. So if you were to say, let's let these territories here go, this is where you have predominantly Kurds living. It wouldn't solve a problem because the largest Kurdish city in the world is where? It's Istanbul. The city with the largest Kurdish population in the world is Istanbul. It's not Diyarbakir, which is probably maybe the number 2 out in the southeast. And that's because there's been, with the development of the Turkish economy has been sucking Kurds, migrating from east to west. So you have lots of Kurds living all throughout Turkey. And economically, they're very integrated. I mean, again, I think the idea of a Kurdish nation state would be a disaster for the Kurds first and foremost, as well as for the rest of the region, in part for this reason. And I hope this current conflict doesn't grow into a real ethnic civil war, because then you'll be faced with potentially you could be faced with massive expulsions of Kurds from the western part of Turkey. I guess I was on to that. I was thinking about this. So as you've had Kurds move into cities like Ankara, Izmir, and Istanbul, their population, they tend to have fewer children as well. And I remember I first discovered this, and I later did some research on it just from talking to taxi drivers. You ask them, when I was learning Turkish, you ask them, are you married? Do you have children, et cetera, et cetera? And so many of them say, just one. It's too expensive to have more. And then a lot of these taxi drivers, particularly today, are Kurdish. And then there's people who've done some research on this as well. What is significant is you do have a lot of young Kurds, and they are one of the most, a lot of young men. They want to take risks. You can mobilize them easily, and that's one of the key things that's going right now inside of Turkey. The southeast economically isn't in great shape, so you have a lot of young Kurds. Remember also the war from the 1990s, which is like most wars, very ugly, and this is one of Turkey's real problems. So I guess what I'm trying to say is a demographic problem. I'm not convinced it will be a huge thing in the future, because patterns do change as people urbanize. But for right now, you have enough young Kurds who are angry and willing to fight, and they might not be the easiest group to convince to stand down. And you've got this group, the PKK, which is quite militant, and which has been fighting a war since 1984. And they see this is our moment. Now even the U.S. is beginning to say, hey, maybe the Kurds could be useful allies. They see this as their moment where they have to grab it. And I think, is a very explosive situation. So whereas Turkey used to always be seen as this great stabilizer in the Middle East, and we took it for granted, and now it looks like it's going more the way of Iraq and Syria.
Well, on that note, please join me.
Thanking